Jane, these Russians in Brazil, they weren't there to spy. Tell us what they were doing.
Yeah, you're right. They weren't there to spy at all. They were there effectively to become Brazilian. So Russia was basically using Brazil as this kind of spy factory and assembly line for building up their deep cover agents, cover identities, so they could travel around the world and pass as Brazilian.
This all started with Victor Muller Ferreira, who was actually named Sergei Cherkasov. Tell us about that case and how it kicked off everything else that was to come.
Yeah, Sergei Cherkasov was the linchpin for the Brazilians for their entire investigation that unraveled the whole spy operation. So he arrived in Brazil under the name Victor Muller Ferreira, and he was probably the most successful of the spies. Really, he was GIU, which is part of the military intelligence unit, and he did an incredible job um, pretending to be Brazilian and building up a really convincing cover identity to the point where he even got into John Hopkins University. He studied in Dublin in Ireland for a while, and just before he was arrested, he'd just got an internship at the International Criminal Court, just as it was about to start investigating Russian war crimes in Ukraine.
And so, how did the case of Ferreira, aka Cherkasov, end up then leading to the Brazilian federal police learning that there were more Russians in deep cover in their country?
I mean, it all started with a tip off from the CIA about Cherkasov, and the Brazilians had barely any time to react. They received this kind of call out of the blue from the CIA, who said, look, there's a suspected Russian spy, Victor Fuller Ferreira, who's on the way. We've just sent him back to Sao Paulo and he's going to be landing, and you need to be ready, basically. To the Brazilians, kind of, this is the federal police in Brazil. They kind of scrambled around trying to get this warrant for his arrest. The judge wasn't convinced, and they had to go back with more evidence that around their suspicions of why he was a spy. So he basically landed. They had to let him go, and they kept him under heavy surveillance at this hotel in Sao Paulo while they kind of anxiously were trying to gather what they could to convince the judge to give them a warrant for his arrest. And they eventually got that. While the Brazilians were digging around trying to prove that he was a Russian spy, the first step was basically to show that he wasn't who he said he was. This was a cover identity. And they started digging around his birth certificate, his Brazilian birth certificate. And what they found, it was an authentic document. It looked legit. It said he had a Brazilian mother. But then when they started digging around and they got to some of his relatives, they found out that actually his mother had never had a son. She'd died, and she'd never had a son sent all by that name, and none of the relatives had heard of him. So that was really the breakthrough for the Brazilians. They knew he was not Victor Muller Ferreira. And the bigger piece of the puzzle that kind of fell into place there was they notice a pattern to how he had built up his cover identity. And it was something that they would end up using to hunt for the other Russian spies in Brazil. Basically, he had, as did the other spies, a birth certificate claiming he was born in Brazil, that he was Brazilian, but then they were basically ghosts in the system for years, for decades, until they suddenly appeared in Brazil as adults and started rapidly getting these ID documents that a lot of Brazilians would have, spent effectively the whole life gathering. So driving license, military record, voter registration, social security number. And that then allowed them to go through, basically trawl millions of ID records, some manually, some automated, some with help from other agencies in Brazil, but basically looking for people who fit the same pattern, these ghosts in the system, effectively.
And these were authentic documents, birth certificates, passports. Previously, we know that Russia used to steal the identities of dead babies. So, what are the theories on how the Russians could have gone about doing this?
Yeah, I mean, the Brazilians, when we started talking to them earlier this year, they thought that the Russians would have obtained these authentic birth records through corruption, paying off some local official to go in a few years before their spies landed to claim the identities and just, fabricate some identities and get the birth certificates that way. But back in April, the Brazilians got the forensic analysis results back, and they were pretty shocked to find that there was no evidence of tampering of the records at all. The paper was authentic, the paper hadn't been tampered with, the ink was authentic, like there was nothing out of the ordinary at all. So now what they're looking at, their hypothesis is that Russia had sent some KGB agents back in the wake of the Cold War in the late 80s, early 90s, and planted these authentic birth certificates ready for, the fictitious identities of spies who hadn't yet been born to come back in, modern times and claim them as identities and carry on kind of the espionage that was going on in the wake of the Cold War. But that's a hypothesis. It's a big mystery right now. It's one of the things the Brazilians are looking at, and certainly the experts we spoke to at other intelligence agencies were surprised in the sense that they hadn't heard of anything of the Russians doing this before. They had no concrete examples, but all of them also said this would be right out of the Kremlin playbook. That type of forward planning and manipulation of systems, like it would be classic Putin.
Incredible foresight if that's how it happened.
Yeah, completely. Some of the sources we spoke to in Western intel services thought that it could have been a mixture of the Russians, but in the wake of the Cold War, the 80s and 90s, getting, saving some paper, saving some ink from that date, so that in future they could then pay off some local officials to then fabricate a birth record, but using kind of authentic documents, ink from that time that would match the other birth records. So it could easily be a combination of both. And it's a big mystery right now, and it's a tantalizing one that the Brazilians are trying to get to the bottom of.
And tell us about some of the Russian operatives that you found through this investigation. Let's start with Artem Shmirov.
Yeah, so Artyom was the main character in our story, and he was particularly interesting because out of all, nine of the spies, he in particular seemed to have really embedded himself in Brazil and really created, a cover story that was so convincing it fooled his Brazilian girlfriend who had no idea he was a spy. He had a bona fide business, a 3D printing business with clients in the military and the media
Yep.
over in Brazil. There was another guy, Eeki Lops, who set up, on paper a jewelry business, but actually when you visited the company, there was nothing there. They had no real clients. It was kind of like a front to just launder his Brazilian identity. Whereas Daniel was different. His friends described someone who was a workaholic. He would often send colleagues and friends home so he could carry on working. He had very little interest that he would share outside of work, just really obsessive into CrossFit. He would go off on these mysterious trips once a year somewhere in Europe. They told the story of how, when he would rarely, but sometimes get very drunk, he would just sit there in silence and kind of space out and just not say anything until his Brazilian girlfriend would take him home. And I don't know if if you were a Russian spy in Brazil, you wouldn't want to get too drunk and start chatting a lot. It could be risky business. But yeah, he was super interesting because of just how, and he was there in Brazil for about I think 8 years in total.
And he sometimes posed as a customer working with other printing businesses, which implies that he has other abilities. And he was afraid of being in pictures. I mean, there were aspects to his identity that could be seen as red flags to those who understand the business.
Yeah, completely. And all the people we spoke to who knew him kind of said at the time they just thought it was a bit odd, that he hated having his photo taken, that he would disconnect his laptop from the Wi-Fi, never leave it open around anybody else. In fact, one of his colleagues at the printing business said that they used to joke about him being wanted by the federal police because he hated having his picture taken so long.
Yeah, public service announcement. Just because you don't like to be in photos doesn't mean that you're necessarily a Russian spy working on behalf of Putin. Um, but there was also a jeweler, and you had described him as speaking gringo Portuguese. He was also afraid of cameras. Tell us more about him.
Yeah, so one of the spies we uncovered was a guy who went by the alias Eeki Lops. His real name was actually Alexander Uchekin. So all we knew about him through some sources and digging around on the knocking on some doors on the ground is that basically he had a jewelry business called FCell Jewelry, and it had offices in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, and Sao Paulo. And we tracked down someone who had met him, a journalist, a TV presenter, who had interviewed him as part of this program about Brazil's successful businesses. And she remembered him because he struck her as really odd in that he, again, said, he paid for this segment. He paid to be featured on this news program, and he didn't want to appear on camera. And he put forward his kind of assistant, who we were told knew so little about the business that she kept fluffing her lines. He had to tell her what to say, but he still wouldn't appear on camera. And when we went knocking on some doors trying to find the jewelry shop and, any employees, what we found is kind of, empty offices and shopping malls in Brasilia. Someone said they used to be here, but no one knows anything about them. And when we tried the office in Sao Paulo, we spoke to a member of staff there who said he'd never heard of the company or Eeki Lops, and he'd worked there for 10 years. But he said that that office was often used as kind of ghost companies or front companies for people who want a legitimate address, but don't have a real company.
So, looking at their qualities, whether they spoke Portuguese in a way that was a bit basic, or they were afraid of being photographed or on camera themselves, uh, were these elite spies?
It's such a good question. And this is kind of contrast, right, in what we've found out. Because on one hand, yes, they are very much Putin's elite spies. They're, these deep cover agents. Like Putin talks about them in this kind of romantic, idolized way because he obviously used to work in the KGB and he always wanted to be one of these illegals. But on the other hand, as we've seen in this case, like some of them aren't that good or they're not very sophisticated. Like, for example, when we got hold of some texts between Artem Shmirev, who went by the name Daniel in Brazil, and his Russian wife. So he had a real Russian wife as well as a Brazilian girlfriend. Um, and the texts really kind of give this interesting insight into what the reality is for these spies who are kind of heralded and held in such high regard in Russia. And actually, it's a pretty frustrating, difficult life. These texts between them,
Yeah,
are
you wrote, she said, it's not as it was promised and it's bad. They basically trick people.
yeah, which is quite a stark take on and certainly the opposite of what we know about these spies and what's certainly projected in Russia. But they're kind of complaining about their lot and how difficult it is, you see, to have a long distance relationship, but also to find to do the job, like she's basically, the wife is complaining about, not having any results. And Artem Shmirev, Daniel, he's talking about just not having achieved very much by his middle 30th year, in his words, and, not much to show for the job. So they give a really interesting insight into the reality of these elite spies. And ultimately all their identities did get blown.
And you were saying to me previous to this conversation that Moscow was really cheap with these guys.
Yeah, these spies had problems with their expenses just like the rest of us. But yeah, we got hold of some messages between Cherkasov and his handler, who we only know by the name Diver. And it was quite revealing because basically Cherkasov was kind of complaining to his handler about needing to find somewhere permanent to live because he was kind of sofa surfing. And when he presented some options for an apartment to buy to his handler with a varying kind of price points from the cheapest in not the nicest area to a slightly nicer one. And there were three options, and he was told by his handler to choose the cheapest option in like a really crummy neighborhood that was for a very small price. So they weren't living kind of a glamorous life. They're scrounging for money to afford a roof over their head.
You got to wonder if Putin knows that they are cheaping out on the illegals program as he's praising them and offering these romantic words.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's always does the rhetoric match with what's going on in the ground. The Brazilians' investigation, the outing of these nine spies, would have really dealt a big blow to Putin because these guys are really expensive to train, even if they're not getting great accommodation. They're really expensive to train. It takes years to build their cover identities, on average around 7 years. So they're super expensive. They're not easy to replace. So one of the questions we have is, where does Russia stand now? It would be naive to think they're the only spies Russia has. Of course not. They're going to have other deep cover agents elsewhere, and there have been cases discovered in Slovenia and Greece, other place in the US in 2010. But it will be interesting to see where Putin and where Russia goes from here after being dealt such a big blow to, his premier spy program.
And Cherkasov is the only one who remains in prison. All of the others slipped away. What is your theory on how that happened?
There are a couple of theories as to why. I mean, one thing to note is that it wasn't just in Brazil. Like these spies were being recalled from other countries, and this was in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where governments and intelligence services all over the world began really cracking down. So they started going after the spies, and they were getting banned. And so Putin, obviously, would have had to pull them out to save them. Otherwise, they could end up in a lockup for many years, like Cherkasov. For now, the Brazilians also had some theories around Artyom Shmirov or Daniel, in that when he went missing or stopped replying to texts and when he went traveling Malaysia, his Brazilian girlfriend got worried and posted his picture and name on a bunch of groups on Facebook, on WhatsApp groups. So suddenly his identity was kind of blown, and the
Oof.
Brazilians think she kind of spooked him and they were
Oh
waiting
man.
for him to come
The
back.
Brazilian police must have just been so upset that that happened. That must have
They
been a
were.
painful day.
Yeah, I mean, they discovered they were onto him like 2 days before he flew out to Malaysia. So he'd just slipped through their fingers and they just were devastated, like when he never turned up. But they did something clever. When they realized these spies had kind of slipped through their fingers, they turned to Interpol, which is the world's largest policing agency, and they use these things called notices. They're different colors: red notices, it's blue notices, and they're basically alerts that go out to all 196 countries which are part of Interpol. And it was a clever move because that means it'll be very difficult for them to work abroad again.
It is interesting that the Brazilians turned to Interpol, using it essentially as a mechanism for revenge. How much of the discovery would you say has to do with the fact that Russia did launch a full scale invasion on Ukraine and so many countries started sharing intelligence with each other? Would all of this have come about were it not for Putin's full scale invasion?
No, I don't think it would have been, not according to the sources we've spoken to, and we've spoken to a lot of intelligence agencies around this. No, I think there's an irony in it. Like, this happened because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine and intelligence services and governments not being willing to sit back and just turn the blind eye or quietly watch them. And what's interesting is Brazil's role in this, right? Because Brazil has long been, proudly politically neutral in many cases, and they have maintained even friendly relations with Russia. But to the cops and the intel officials we spoke to, this was a case of They were pissed. They were pissed that Russia had exploited Brazil and its political neutrality, and the fact it had tried to stay everyone's friend, and still does to a large extent, to use its territory to basically exploit Brazil's diversity, multicultural population, which makes it easy for spy to blend in and claim nationality. Its ID systems, which had weaknesses in it, which they could use to get these authentic birth certificates, which were the base of building these cover identities. And they were kind of like, right, this is a step too far, and we're not going to stand for it.
So why would Russia exploit Brazil, especially when after the full-scale invasion, Brazil stayed pretty neutral on the matter? And why would Brazil then so brazenly try to root out these Russian spies?
I think Putin always has Russia's interest first, whatever the geopolitics. And clearly, Brazil was just such a useful territory, useful place for Russian spies to build these cover identities. And to Putin, we know like how important this spy program, this illegals program, was. So I think he just thought, what our sources are telling us, he just thought this is too good opportunity to miss, and we'll deal with the politics afterwards. And as for the Brazilians, I think of note is just the separation between police and politics, right? And these are cops. It's not just any cops. This is a unit which investigated Brazil's former president Bolsonaro for allegedly plotting a coup, right? They're not afraid to put politics aside to go after people who are exploiting or misusing Brazil's systems, right? But even after putting this story out, there's been some ministers who have come out and basically said, no, we don't have a real problem here. There's not that many Russian spies, and the federal police shouldn't be investigating this anyway. This was a formal statement. So I think it's pretty bold of them to make a stand on this.
So, with these different spy agencies now sharing information with one another, do you think that this is likely a formula that will be used to catch other Russian spies moving forward? And then maybe not even just Russian spies, but Iranian spies, Cuban spies, Chinese spies?
I think definitely it's going to be used, and we have heard from sources, other countries who are very interested in looking at the tradecraft pattern here and whether it might apply in their countries as well. So definitely in terms of Russian spies, I think lessons are being learned, and other countries, their intelligence agencies, the police, the governments are looking at whether this happened in other countries. And of course, like, it would be naive to think this was only Brazil.
And where does the investigation in Brazil currently stand? What more are they hoping to uncover now that they've found these 9 operatives who have gotten away?
Yeah, so the investigation in Brazil is still ongoing. It's very much active. The key question now is how the Russians did it. So they can figure that out. They can see, well, one, they can prove that they're spies, these people, because it's really hard to prove that someone is spying for another country. It's easier to prove your falsified identity documents, which is how they got Cherkasov. But to prove anything higher, it's going to take a lot more evidence. So they're currently trying to find out as much as they can about the spies they do know, the 9 spies they do know, particularly some of the newer names, and looking at how they got their Brazilian ID documents in the hope that will kind of blow open the wider Russian operation. And the more they learn, the more they can use it to look for other spies, whether it's in Brazil or other countries, certainly in South America and elsewhere.
And this report ended with acknowledgement of the toll that this took on the people who lived around these illegals, particularly Artem, the 3D printer who had a girlfriend. His girlfriend, his friends, they seemed to miss him despite his false identity. What does that tell us?
It's quite extraordinary, actually. When went round Brazil speaking to the people who knew Artyom or Daniel, we found 2 friends of his, business clients, who had turned friends so close they shared a birthday party together. And They didn't know his real name, and we actually told them his real name, and they Philippi, this is, he kind of paused for a moment and kind of tried out kind of these unfamiliar syllables, and then he was just kind of shrugged his shoulder and says, well, to us, he's Daniel. There wasn't like the sense of betrayal, or at least the betrayal didn't overtake their fondness for him. And they were just like, look, we just want to know if he's okay. And we hope one day we'll meet in a bar in St. Petersburg and we'll to raise a glass of vodka and have a chat. They just wanted to know he's okay. And despite the betrayal, lying about who they were to him, they liked him. And I don't know if that's a sign of uh, him being a really good spy, or their theory is that he genuinely wanted to stay in Brazil. He had a really nice life there, with his girlfriend, the nice apartment, the cat, his friends. Like, and I can tell you, Rio is lovely in February, and the rest of the year. So they think he wanted to stay. Whether or not it was all a lie, or whether there was a part of him that wanted to stay, we won't know. One of our questions was, where are they now? And we don't have hard answers, but the intel sources we spoke to all believe they're back in Russia. And tantalizingly, Artyom, or Daniel's, telegram messages seen, he's active, and we know some of the spies had takeaway deliveries to their addresses over there, or matching the spies' names, identities. So it does seem they are in Russia, but we would love to find out. And this is what we'll, part of our reporting will focus on if we get anywhere, is what happened to them, because they have left behind, a lot of broken hearts and unanswered questions. Artyom's girlfriend has found the whole thing too difficult. To talk about. She didn't want to talk to us, and we understand from friends that she took it really hard. The man she loved wasn't who he said he was. He was a Russian spy who had a secret Russian wife.
And I wonder whether Artem would ever reach out to the people that he knew in Brazil if he's safe in Russia. Wouldn't that be interesting to think? There are just so many mysteries here.
There are, and when we text the number that might be his, we said that his friends want to know how he's doing. I'm sure he'll have ways he can reach out if he wants to, though I can't imagine it would be very safe to if he is in Moscow. But yeah, it's a big mystery what happened to them.
What comes next for them with their covers blown? What kind of careers they can have? Not everybody can be Anna Chapman, have a TV show, have a book.
No, I mean, it's a big question. They certainly can't work as spies again. We do know, Putin idolizes them, and there was the couple in Slovenia, whose identities were blown, who Moscow had managed to get back to Russia, and they were given a hero's welcome, like televised cameras, like television cameras everywhere, a bouquet of flowers, Putin directly greeting them. But they were also pretty successful. They'd been undercover for many more years than a lot of these spies. So I guess what lies next to them for them will probably depend on how successful they were in their time as deep covers.
Jane, thank you so much for sharing your reporting. You got to keep us posted.
Thank you, I will, and thanks for having me.